Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to the first Global Dialogue Series of the year, hosted by the World Climate Institute and in association with the Gujarat Chamber of Commerce and Industry and the Indian Green Business Council. Well, our mission today is to explore leadership in action, the lessons and opportunities. My name is Laura Buckwell, and it's a great pleasure to be your host for the rest of the day. Well, we are here in the vibrant city of Ahmedabad and broadcasting live in India's G20 presidency year as well. A very fruitful year ahead, in fact. The event today, by the way, is being streamed live on the WCI website. That is the worldclimateinstitute.org. And to join the conversation, please do use our Twitter handle, which is @WCI Updates. Well, ladies and gentlemen, for the next 90 minutes, we are going to be joined by a rotation of prominent experts from around the world. And we'd like to start today with a very special guest who's come all the way from the UK, in fact. Please join me in welcoming our first speaker, who is an MP, Director of Climate and Parliament, and former Shadow Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change for the UK government. He is also the recipient of the illustrious Padma Shri Award here from India. He is here to talk about climate leadership and the role that parliamentarians can play in helping countries realize their climate targets. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together. Give a very warm welcome to the Honourable Barry Gardiner, MP.
Hi, Laura.
Lovely to have you here. Please do be seated.
Thank you.
So we have very little time, of course, as always, and so much to talk about. Thank you so much for being with us here today, first and foremost. I wanted to put you straight in the deep end, actually, if you don't mind. If you had to describe the current state of climate leadership in just one word, what would that be?
One word.
One word. You've just got one word. That's it.
Unscientific.
Interesting.
What do the scientists tell us? They tell us that there is a limit to the emissions that we can put into the atmosphere. We probably have about 8 or 9 years left before we reach the 1.5 degree threshold that the Paris Climate Agreement has set. Now, we are acting as if we can stand up against the laws of physics and say, no, you don't seem to realize that actually our population won't accept that. Or we can't possibly, change our entire energy power system in such a short space of time. We can't argue with the planet. We can't argue with the science. And yet what's happening is governments around the world, leaders around the world are saying, well, actually, we'll set targets, but they won't be adequate. Or we'll set adequate targets, but we won't then put in place the policies to implement those targets. And, the atmosphere, it's like a car park. You can get so many emissions in there, but if you try and push too many in, they start falling over the edge. And that's where we are. We're at that sort of tipping point stage. And you look at what's happened in India in the past year. The heat waves, the drought, the impact on farmers. Look at what's happened over the past 5 years. 70 million hectares of productive farmland in India has been lost. Why? Because of climate change, because of drought.
And didn't HSBC also name India as the most vulnerable country when it comes to climate change?
Yes, you're right. They did, and for a number of reasons there. But I think, look, there are also seeds of hope in India. And I think it's very easy to simply paint a picture of doom and gloom and it's all going to be dreadful. That doesn't motivate people. What motivates people is going out there and saying, look, this is a huge opportunity. It's a huge economic opportunity. I hope in some of the other discussions we have this afternoon, we'll see just what those economic opportunities are. But this is a transformation of our system that is really worth having. You look out over the skyline in Ahmedabad today, and hey, it's hazy, it's cloudy. What is that? It's pollution. You get rid of climate change, you get rid of fossil fuel emissions, and actually you have a cleaner atmosphere, you have healthier people, you have a healthier workforce. There are so many positives that are going to come with this transformation. And the economic opportunities are superb, because if you look now at the relative costs of producing electricity by solar versus fossil fuels, hey, solar wins hands down. And that, for India, is an enormous opportunity, because here we have a country blessed with so much solar power. And of course, as a good Gujarati, I hope that Gujarat's going to be right at the center of that.
Sure it will.
And,
sure it will.
You know, we've got the green hub here in Gujarat. So I think there's a lot to be excited about.
But also, change isn't just going to happen overnight. It's going to be a long process, and it can be quite chaotic. Change is always chaotic. Isn't that right?
Yes, it is. And there are also people who want to resist that change. Change is difficult. It's difficult. We know that at a personal level. And it's about changing the practices that we have around the world. I come from a country, you know, unlike here in India, I come from a country where, you know, people eat a lot of meat. Changing their practice so they adopt a more vegetarian-based diet or a plant-based diet is going to be very difficult. But it's happening. It's happening quite steadily. 10 years ago, if you said you were a vegetarian in the UK, you were odd. If you said you were a vegan in the UK, you were even odder. Now, there are so many vegan restaurants, it's all on the menu. These are the changes that are happening. And sometimes we look and think, oh, we haven't gone far enough. And we haven't. But the good news is actually we've covered a huge distance already, and we just have to keep going.
Very quickly, I'm watching the time, of course. Let's take a little bit, take a look at the role of parliamentarians. And
Right, yeah.
What can they play in terms of change? And do you think it's a matter of getting more diplomats out there when it comes to global change? I mean, what is the way forward?
Listen, you're going to be interviewing diplomats later, so Freddie can answer that one. But parliamentarians play a critical role, because they're the people ultimately that decide on the legislation. But they do more than that. They don't just vote through legislation. They also hold the government's feet to the fire. They're the ones who say, well, look, you've promised this. You've set these targets in place, but you're nowhere near achieving them. Now, if you look at the targets that India has set for renewables up to 2030, I think the expectation is that there will be 50 gigawatt of renewables into play. But actually, India is already set to overachieve that target by about 66, 67%. What does that tell you as a legislator? It can either tell you, how wonderful, isn't it amazing what we're doing? Or it can tell you this, you know what? We set targets, not that were in line with the science, but targets that we knew we could achieve so we would look good when we said that we met the targets. Now, the legislators are the people charged with actually judging which way the government's done this. Has it just overachieved magnificently? Or did it set targets that were too low? And these are the sort of things that legislators have to really critique government about. And there are different systems around the world. In my own parliament, we have a system of select committees, and we grill ministers. And we grill ministers from the same party as ourselves. So we make sure that we're holding their feet to the fire. We're making sure that not just they meet the commitments that they've made, but they've actually made the right commitments.
Do you think that the world is now looking more towards the South then when it comes to climate leadership across Africa, the Middle East, India, of course? And why is that, do you think? And what sort of opportunities are there, especially in this part of the world?
Well, look, I think COP27 that we've just had last month in Sharm el-Sheikh was a very good example of that. It was the first COP to be held in Africa. It was billed as the African COP. And the influence that African nations and the Global South were able to exert on that COP really did change the outcomes. I'd been pushing for many years to try and ensure that loss and damage was right at the forefront of the decision making. It happened. It happened in Sharm el-Sheikh. And that was a huge thing that it did happen, because that means that countries who have suffered because of climate change, they've suffered the damage. They've experienced the floods. They've experienced the droughts. They've lost the agricultural base. They're the ones who will actually be able to get some compensation for that. So, yeah, it's really important. And if you look at the work that India was doing at that COP, India came out at that COP and said, look, we don't just need to phase down coal, which was the decision taken in the Glasgow COP. We actually need to phase down fossil fuels. Yeah, that was a huge thing for India to come out and say and to support at the COP. So you do see countries from the Global South increasingly taking that leadership role. And I think that's really, really important that they do.
It really is. What examples do you think can nations such as India set for the global community? What are they leaders in when it comes to this space, and what example can they set?
Well, look, there's a number of things that India is doing. I would say that the Solar Alliance that India has is really superb. The One Sun, One World, One Grid that Narendra Modi launched, first of all in Paris, and then that we had the grid structure added on in Glasgow. So we're looking at a global green grid structure. Now that is real innovation. To be able to say that you produce solar power here in India, you then have interconnection that goes through right across the stands into North Africa, up into Europe, so that the world is beginning to see that it's connected in its energy matrix. That's absolutely critical.
One of my last questions to you, actually, I wanted to go over, take a look at the UK for a moment. Your thoughts on the UK announcement of £30 million that was deployed to support developing countries to protect 30% of land and ocean by 2030. That was recently announced, I believe. Tell us about your thoughts on that package.
Well, look, this is actually not something that is predominantly about climate change. This was a decision that was taken at COP15 rather than COP27. COP15 was the Convention on Biological Diversity Conference of the Party that took place in Montreal just after we'd had COP27. And I think the importance of this is that increasingly the world is coming to realize that there is not simply a climate crisis. It's a climate and biodiversity crisis. It's a climate and nature crisis. If you look at the Living Index report that came out, there has been a 69% decline in species abundance since 1970. 69% of all the species on the planet have reduced in their numbers. So that is quite extraordinary. But the 30 million that the UK, it's a figure, 30 million pounds. What is that going to achieve internationally? Next to nothing. But it will have some key projects towards that. Having those targets, though, 30% of protected areas, it is important to have the targets. But as we were saying before, it's much more important that we have the policies in place to achieve them. And I remember when the first round of what are known as NBSAPs, that's National Biodiversity Strategic Action Plans, right? Crazy mnemonic, but there we are, came out. And actually, I won't name the country, but in one of the country's NBSAPs, these strategic action plans that were supposed to be signed off by ministers, they made all these wonderful boasts about, 17% of our land is protected area, we do all this. And then they said in the plan, but actually, whenever poachers come and invade those protected areas, and take out wildlife, what's happening is the real problem we have is not that it's not designated a protected area. The problem is that our ministers and our judges let these people off the hook when they come to court. Now, what did that show? It showed that no minister had ever read that NBSAP. They didn't know what their targets were. They didn't know what their protected areas were. I'm happy to say that their second NBSAP wasn't that bad. But you have to make sure that you're not just creating paper parks, whether on land or in sea. Protected areas must be protected. It's now not about targets and protected areas. It's about implementation. It's about making sure that you are delivering the emissions reductions, you're delivering the adaptation in climate, you're making sure that the areas that you're protecting see that enhancement of biodiversity, that increase in habitat that is so important for the whole climate and environmental catastrophe that's going on.
Fantastic dialogue there. I think that's quite a good point.